She didn't show up to play it safe or to blend in with the typical TV banter. From the moment she stepped on that stage, the energy shifted. Her posture, her presence, the look in her eyes, it all signaled that she wasn't there to smile and nod along to the same tired lines that get passed around like party favors. She came with purpose, with fire, with a truth that was clearly burning to be said out loud in a space that too often glosses over reality with scripted comfort. You could feel it before she even spoke a word. This wasn't going to be one of those appearances where someone tries to win favor by being agreeable. No, she was ready for friction. And friction came fast. The questions started off wrapped in politeness, but the intent was clear. They wanted to prod, to poke, to draw out a misstep or a soundbite they could twist. But she didn't flinch. Instead of taking the bait, she took control. She didn't just answer the questions, she challenged their foundation. When one of the co-hosts threw a subtly loaded statement her way, expecting her to backpedal or soften her position, she did the exact opposite. Her response was swift, grounded, and laced with hard truth. There was no shaking in her voice, no nervous laugh to ease the tension, just clarity, precision, fire. That's the thing about someone who shows up with conviction. There's a calm power to it, an unshakable rhythm. She wasn't reactive, she was surgical. She peeled back the layers of surface-level commentary and exposed what was really going on. And the most powerful part? She didn't raise her voice or talk over anyone. She didn't need to. Her words carried weight and everyone in the room felt it. She didn't flood the conversation with noise. She brought the kind of silence that follows after a truth bomb drops. There was a moment, just a flicker, when one of the hosts tried to steer the narrative back into safer waters, back to the talking points that usually go unchallenged. But it didn't work. She calmly redirected the conversation, pulled it back into the uncomfortable reality that no one else wanted to acknowledge. She had data. She had lived experience. She had an edge sharpened not by anger, but by insight. And once she had the floor, it was impossible to look away. What made the moment so electric wasn't just what she said, but how she said it. There was a rhythm to her speech, a deliberate pacing, a careful stacking of facts, and then the release of a piercing truth that cut through all the pretense. It was a masterclass in control, in presence. She didn't just speak, she commanded. And the more they tried to pivot away, the more it became clear they weren't equipped to match her clarity. At one point, the audience reaction made it obvious that something real was happening. People weren't just listening, they were waking up. You could hear the nervous laughs, the shuffling in chairs, the uneasy glances between co-hosts who suddenly realized they weren't holding the upper hand. That's what happens when someone shows up with fire in their voice and purpose in their eyes. They don't just participate in the discussion, they redefine it. The power of her performance was in the contrast. Against the backdrop of a show, built on predictability, she brought unpredictability. Against the comfort of scripted banter, she brought truth unscripted. She exposed how easily the narrative gets bent to fit certain agendas, how quickly nuance disappears when it gets in. The way of a clean headline. And the way she laid it all out, not with arrogance but with assurance, left no room for easy dismissal. When someone walks into a space already stacked against them and flips the power dynamic without raising a single decibel, that's not luck. That's strategy. That's preparation. That's knowing who you are and why you're there. She wasn't interested in applause or viral moments, though she got both. What she wanted was to cut through the noise. And in a space known for noise, that made her presence unforgettable. She didn't walk in hoping for acceptance. She walked in with the knowledge that truth doesn't need to be approved to be valid. And when truth comes armed with fire, even the most carefully controlled environments can't hold it back. They thought they had the perfect setup. A well-timed question, loaded with implication, designed to paint her into a corner. The kind of moment where guests typically fumble, backtrack, or offer a vague, non-committal response to avoid backlash. It's a tactic that's been used countless times. Pose the question just right, deliver it with a knowing smile, and wait for the stumble. But this time, it didn't go according to plan. because she saw it coming. She didn't blink, didn't shift uncomfortably in her seat. Instead, she leaned in, figuratively and emotionally, and flipped the script before anyone could even process what was happening. Her response wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was deliberate, sharp, and devastating in its clarity. She didn't fall into the trap because she never viewed it as one. She dissected the question on the spot, laying bare its assumptions and turning them back around on the panel with a calm precision that sent shockwaves through the studio. The moment was subtle, but it hit hard. It was one of those live-on-air reversals where you could feel the air get sucked out of the room. Because what was meant to be a gotcha moment for her turned out to be a mirror held up to everyone else. She challenged the question not just on its face, but on the framing. She exposed how selective the outrage had become, how certain topics were only brought up when it was politically convenient or when it fit a predetermined storyline. And she did it with surgical grace, walking the audience step by step through the hypocrisy without ever raising her voice. There was no aggression, only precision. The kind of precision that makes even the most seasoned hosts second-guess their next line. What made the moment truly brilliant was how she remained composed throughout. There was no smirk, no smug satisfaction, just facts. She referenced real-world consequences, called out the absence of context in the narrative being pushed, and reminded everyone watching that intellect and courage still have a place in public discourse. It was a rhetorical reversal so complete that even the host who posed the question was left scrambling to pivot. And pivot they did, clumsily, awkwardly, trying to shift the topic and regain control of the moment. But the momentum was already gone. The narrative had changed, and she was now driving it. This wasn't just about one exchange. It was about the way she turned the tables in a space not designed for that kind of shift. She wasn't the one under pressure anymore. The spotlight had moved, and those who were used to asking the questions were now the ones dodging answers. That's a rare thing to watch in real time, the power balance of a conversation tilting on live television, driven not by volume or confrontation, but by pure, unapologetic truth. She reminded everyone of the power of being prepared, not just with talking points, but with actual understanding. There was a depth to her answer that couldn't be faked. She wasn't improvising. She was drawing from lived experience, from insight, from a place of grounded purpose. That's why the moment landed so hard. She wasn't trying to win the room, she was trying to wake it up. Even the audience, which usually plays along with the rhythm of the show, took a beat. The applause didn't come immediately. First, there was silence. That kind of silence that comes when someone says what everyone knows but no one's been willing to say. And then, the reaction came. Not from force, but from recognition. People knew they had just witnessed something real, something that cut through the performance and exposed the truth beneath it. It wasn't just a comeback. It was a realignment, a reframing. The question that was meant to trip her up became the launchpad for a deeper critique of the entire conversation. And once she took it there was no coming back to the surface level stuff. The tone of the show shifted, and it never quite returned to its original rhythm. She didn't just recover from the attempted ambush. She dismantled it, calmly and completely. That's the kind of presence that doesn't just answer questions. The tension wasn't imagined. It was real, thick enough to feel through the screen. From the moment she started speaking, the energy shifted. There's a distinct change that happens when someone refuses to follow the script. She wasn't there. To be agreeable, to give the kind of smooth, polished answers that allow everyone to move on to the next segment without discomfort. No, she had something to say, and she wasn't going to wrap it in soft language to make it easier to digest. Every word, every pause, every pointed glance, she owned it all. There was no hesitation in her voice, no attempt to dilute her message for the sake of harmony. As the conversation heated up, it became clear she wasn't pulling back. If anything, she leaned further in. She didn't talk over anyone, but she didn't let anyone talk over her either. The usual interruptions, the little techniques used to steer strong voices off course, fell flat. She refused to let them derail her. Her posture stayed open, her voice steady, but her eyes said everything. This wasn't just a conversation to her. It was a reckoning, and she was more than ready for it. You could tell the panel wasn't expecting this kind of composure under pressure. They've seen guests fold, stumble, or try to charm their way out of tough moments. But charm wasn't the currency she brought. She brought truth. She brought experience. And she brought a kind of inner fire that made it impossible to dismiss her. When the tension in the room rose, she didn't flinch. She rose with it. She used it. There was no fear in her, no shrinking, only clarity. One of the hosts tried to interrupt, a soft deflection meant to lighten the moment, but she didn't. Let it land. Without raising her tone, she held her ground and pushed forward, delivering a statement that cut through the noise like a blade. It wasn't just what she said, it was how she said it, calm, measured, inevitable. Like she knew, the room wasn't used to someone like her holding the floor, without permission. And she was determined to do it anyway. The room got quieter with each sentence. Not because people weren't interested, but because they were listening. Really listening. That kind of silence only comes when someone speaks, with such conviction, such honesty, that even the most skeptical voices have to pause. You could see it in the eyes of the hosts. The smiles faded. The body language shifted. The rehearsed confidence gave way to a quieter, more watchful demeanor. They weren't leading the conversation anymore. She was. There's something powerful about a person who refuses to be moved off their message. She didn't waver, didn't water it down. She let the awkward moments stretch. She let the silence linger after she spoke, forcing the room to sit with her words instead of rushing to fill the space. That takes guts. That takes an unshakable sense of purpose. And that's what made the whole exchange so electric. She challenged the assumptions being made in real time. She questioned the framework of the discussion itself, and she did it not with anger, but with strength. Not with volume, but with impact. Each time someone tried to pivot, she brought it right back to the heart of the issue. Not to win a debate, but to speak truth to a national audience that rarely hears it in such raw, unfiltered form. The host tried to reset the tone several times, hoping to regain the rhythm, hoping to move past the discomfort. But she wouldn't. Let them off the hook. She kept pressing, not out of aggression, but out of responsibility. She knew she had a platform, even if just for a few minutes, and she wasn't going to waste it playing nice. She wasn't angry. She was exact. She was calm but cutting, and the contrast made it impossible to look away. What unfolded wasn't just a disagreement or a spirited debate. It was a disruption. A powerful, unapologetic interruption to the usual flow of things. She didn't just enter the space, she reshaped it. She didn't match the tone, they had to adjust to hers. And by the end, it was clear. She had shifted the balance. They couldn't ignore her. They couldn't soften what she said. They could only sit with it and reckon with the fact that they'd been matched and surpassed by someone who refused to play the game by their rules. The moment she walked off that set, you could feel it. Something had changed. Not just in the energy of the show, but in the audience, in the online reaction, in the way the clip instantly started making its rounds before the credits even finished, rolling. It wasn't just a strong appearance, it was a dismantling. What started as a seemingly routine segment quickly turned into a full-on shift in tone, power, and perception. She didn't storm in with theatrics or anger. She simply showed up with truth and didn't flinch when it got uncomfortable. That, in itself, became the story. When the cameras started rolling, the panel probably expected another polished guest who would hit their talking points, smile politely, and maybe offer a few bold but controlled remarks. Instead, they got a force of nature. Someone who refused to fall in line or sugarcoat anything for the sake of keeping the mood light. She didn't come to entertain, she came to challenge. And once she started speaking, it was clear that this wasn't going to be one of those forgettable interviews people tune out before the commercial break. The hosts threw questions at her with the usual tone of authority. But they quickly realized she wasn't intimidated by the setting. In fact, she thrived in it. With each answer, she chipped away at the narrative they tried to frame around her. She didn't dodge questions. She redirected them, right back to the issues that really mattered. And with every redirect, she exposed the cracks in the surface-level discussion, laying bare just how much of it was performative. What made the moment hit even harder was how calm she stayed while completely deconstructing the conversation. There was no ranting, no shouting, just steady, pointed truth delivered with clarity and precision. She had no need to raise her voice because the facts she brought spoke louder than any volume could. And the more they tried to soften her edge with banter or light jokes, the more she leaned into the seriousness of the moment. It wasn't about scoring points, it was about being real. There came a point in the conversation when even the audience seemed to shift. The usual applause breaks were missing. Instead, there were long silences, those heavy, unmistakable pauses that happen when people are processing something they didn't expect to hear. She wasn't telling people what they wanted to hear. She was telling them what they needed to hear. And whether they agreed or not, no one could ignore her. Even the co-hosts, seasoned as they were, couldn't quite mask their discomfort. Their expressions went from confident to cautious. They weren't just moderating anymore. They were reacting. She had flipped the dynamic. They weren't leading the conversation. They were trying to keep up. That's what happens when someone comes in so fully grounded in their message that no amount of deflection or interruption can shake them. She didn't just bring confidence, she brought command. The conversation had barely ended before social media exploded. Clips of the exchange were everywhere. People weren't just watching, they were rewinding, replaying, quoting. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was undeniable. She had gone into a space known for controlling the narrative and wrested control back in real time. And she didn't do it with theatrics. She did it with unapologetic truth, delivered in a way that couldn't be spun. Even the network had to take notice. They're used to shaping public opinion, not being shaped by it. But this time, the story wasn't theirs to tell. She had taken it, owned it, and left nothing on the table. There was no walking away from that exchange without acknowledging what had just happened. Something authentic had broken through the surface. Something bold and unfiltered had been broadcast to millions, and no amount of spin could package it into something safer. What she proved more than anything is that you don't need permission to speak powerfully. You don't need to soften your message to be heard. And when someone walks into a room with that kind of self-possession, that kind of clarity, even the most controlled settings become unpredictable. Because truth, when spoken with fire and fearlessness, doesn't just echo, it disrupts. It leaves a mark, and that's exactly what she did. What happened on that stage wasn't just another media moment to be buried beneath the next news cycle. It was a cultural tremor. In a setting built to maintain control, to shape narratives through subtle bias and polished tones, she refused to play by the usual rules. She didn't break decorum. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't shout anyone down. But she didn't bow either. She stood in full command of her truth, and with quiet defiance, she upended a conversation meant to contain her. The brilliance of it all was in how naturally it unfolded. There were no gimmicks, no slogans, no applause lines crafted for effect, just conviction, clarity, and an unwavering refusal to let others dictate her worth or rewrite the issues that matter. Her words carried the weight of lived experience and unshakable purpose. She didn't come to be agreeable. She came to be honest. And that honesty resonated far beyond the studio lights. The reaction was immediate. People saw something they weren't used to seeing. A woman who wouldn't yield under pressure, who wouldn't dilute her message to make it more palatable, who wouldn't let polished media personalities twist her narrative into something safe and sterile. She walked in as herself and walked out unchanged, and that authenticity struck a nerve. Because at a time when so many voices are muffled by spin, she reminded the country what it looks like when someone speaks plainly and fearlessly, no matter the cost. She didn't need to dismantle anyone personally. She didn't resort to insults or one-liners. Her strength came from something far deeper, an ability to cut through the performance and speak directly to the audience, even while surrounded by cameras and critics. And by the end, the entire tone of the conversation had shifted. What started as an attempt to press her became a showcase of her unshakable resolve. That's why the moment lingered. That's why the clip went viral, why the responses poured in, and why people kept talking about it long after the segment ended. It wasn't because it was loud or explosive, it was because it was real. And in a media landscape full of noise, real always rises. In the end, she didn't just hold her ground, she redefined it. She reminded viewers that courage doesn't always shout. Sometimes it speaks with calm certainty, and that alone can shake the walls. She walked into a space that wasn't built for her to win and left having turned the table entirely. That's not just a victory. That's a message. A message that when truth is spoken with clarity and without fear, it cannot be silenced, no matter how powerful the platform.